Hello and welcome back to Fundamentals in Ecology, where today we will be talking about conditions and resources. Both of these are fundamental to understanding, both conditions and resources are fundamental to understanding how communities, which are sets of populations of multiple species, actually are structured and how they function. And conditions and resources are the concept of these conditions and resources is very closely related to the concept of the niche, which we will be talking about next in the next lecture. So conditions or environmental conditions, a condition is an abiotic environmental factor that influences the functioning of living organisms. One of those could be, for example, temperature. You could have a polar bear functions well at low temperatures but will not be able to function well at high temperatures, right? So these are abiotic conditions. These are not biotic conditions. These are not biotic interactions such as competition, predation, and so on will not be included in the definition of an environmental condition or a condition. So some examples of these are temperature, humidity, the partial pressure of atmospheric gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, salinity in marine or systems, which is the amount of salt that is there in water, and the concentration of pollutants. These are some examples of conditions. Now, conditions cannot be used up, right? They cannot be depleted. Any condition is a property of the abiotic environment. It's a property of the environment in which a species lives, and this cannot be used up, right? You cannot use up temperature or and so on. But organisms can change the conditions that they live in. Yeah. So because an organism is present in a particular location and it functions in a certain way, for example, a plant takes in carbon dioxide and changes puts out oxygen, organisms can change the conditions that they live in. And all of this is related to the concept of the niche, as I was saying earlier, because you could describe a polar bear as being cold adapted and its niche being low temperature. So all of this is related to the concept of the niche. Now, some things can be conditions and resources, and we'll get to what those are, but there is this concept of every species having some kind of optimal condition. Let's say it's some lizard, right? And what you've got on the left side is some condition varying along the x-axis. Let's say that's temperature. Yeah. And what you're asking is, or measuring is, how can I look at the survival rate, the growth rate, and the reproduction rate of this species across a temperature gradient? And what this curve is showing on the left side is that there is a certain optimal temperature for this particular species of lizard. At that optimal temperature, which is the center of that curve, which is the middle of that bell curve, middle of that what looks like a normal distribution, in the middle of that is where reproduction rate, growth rate, and survival rate are all highest. Yes. As you move away from that optimum, which is in the center of that graph, as you move away from the optimum and go towards lower temperatures or higher temperatures, conditions become not as optimal. Conditions become worse for this species, right? So the species can survive across a broad temperature range. The species can grow across some temperature range, but it is smaller than the survival rate, than the range in which the species can survive, and the species can reproduce in a certain range of temperatures which is smaller than the range of temperatures in which it can grow and in which it can survive. So here is an environmental condition it could be anything, just hypothetically we're saying this is temperature, where a species can survive from one temperature extreme to another temperature extreme, but it might not be able to grow and reproduce in some part of the range in which it's surviving. The environmental conditions need to become more optimum for that species, that it simply is not surviving but is also able to reproduce and grow. So the range within which a species can survive, this is a hypothetical example, the range within which a species can survive on some environmental condition gradient can be larger than the range in which a species can grow, which can be larger than the range of that environmental condition in which a species can actually reproduce. And so as you move away from the optimum, you're moving away from the ability to reproduce. You can still grow in some part of that gradient of that environmental condition, even though you cannot reproduce. And when you move away from that, maybe there will be a part of that environmental gradient where you can't grow anymore, but you can survive. You can survive, but you're not able to reproduce, you're not able to grow in that part of that environmental gradient. What we are seeing on the left is basically some optimum temperature at which a species is able to survive, grow and reproduce best. And as you move away from that optimal temperature to lower temperatures or to higher temperatures, survival, growth and reproduction are affected negatively. It goes down on either side of that mean. What we're seeing on the right is that this environmental condition, like temperature for example, is only lethal at high intensities. So at low intensities of this environmental gradient, this species can survive, it can grow and reproduce. Well, as the conditions become more and more extreme, as temperatures for example go higher, then at extreme temperatures the ability to grow, reproduce and survive comes down. So these are two potential ways in which environmental conditions can affect a species, can affect the performance of a species, can affect the fitness of a species in terms of survival, growth and reproduction. Resources are unlike conditions. These are things that are actually consumed by an organism, right? And these are limited in nature. They can be used up, they can be depleted. So very often when we think of resources, the first thing that comes to our mind is food. What are species eating? What are species consuming in terms of food? That is, yes, one type of resource that is limiting in the environment, and yes, there are species that will compete with each other to access those resources, access that food. But a resource is anything that can be used up, which is that if one individual in the environment accesses a unit of that resource, that unit is no longer available to other individuals in the community, either of the same species or of different species. So food, water, yes, tree holes, like this woodpecker is nesting in a tree cavity, and once the woodpecker uses the tree cavity, that tree cavity is no longer available for other woodpeckers or other organisms like squirrels or monitor lizards to use anymore to raise children. So this is a limiting resource. There is a limited number of tree cavities available in the environment. So the resource is different from a condition in that the resource can be depleted, can be used up, whereas a condition cannot be depleted. A condition cannot be used up. Again, this is related to the concept of the niche. One way of describing this woodpecker would be to say this woodpecker's niche, nesting niche or breeding niche is tree cavities, and that's one way in which to describe the way in which this organism uses resources. So often when people talk about niches, they talk about the way in which organisms are adapted to conditions and the way in which organisms use resources. So you could say a cold adapted species or a warm adapted species as an example of its niche. Or you could say this is a plant, or this is a plant that tolerates high salinity, or this is a plant that is more adapted towards fresh water rather than salt water. That's one way in which to describe the niche of a species, by saying what kind of conditions is the species adapted to. Another way is to use resources, and say this is a cavity nesting species, or this species is a carnivore or a predator because it utilizes certain kinds of resources. Where a species is found in either geographical space or in time depends on whether that environment has the minimum amount of resources required for positive population growth rate. So, as we've seen with population ecology, if you have a population growth rate of 1, then your population size is stable, it's neither increasing or nor declining. If you have a population growth rate that is negative and remains negative, then what will happen over time is that your population will decline to extinction. If the population growth rate is greater than 1, then population size is increasing. And so wherever a species is found and remains at some kind of either stable or positive population growth rate depends on how much of the resource that it requires is available in the population. So species are found, they occur, they are distributed in regions, in areas of space and in time where those resources are available at that minimum level required to maintain positive population growth. Now, resources can be defined and described in various ways. So there are categories of resources. Essential resources are resources without which a species or an organism cannot exist. That essential resource is necessary for that species to survive, to reproduce, to grow. Examples of this are, for instance, oxygen for us, nitrogen and potassium for plants. If nitrogen and potassium are not available, then plants are not going to be able to survive and reproduce and grow. So that's an essential resource. That's a resource without which there is no possibility of the occurrence of that organism. That organism is dependent on that essential resource. There can be essential resources that are perfectly substitutable, in that, for example, a predator like a tiger that is preying on either deer or on bison the tiger can meet its nutritional needs from either feeding on a deer or feeding on a bison. So those two resources are substitutable. One can be substituted for the other. That does not mean that both those resources are of the same quality necessarily. It could mean that for the tiger, one bison is equivalent to 2 deer. So in terms of units, the quality of those units is not identical, but the nature of those units is identical in that one can be substituted for the other. You can have resources that are complementary, in that they are not perfectly substitutable, but if you have those two resources, if an organism utilizes those two resources, then it is getting certain value from one resource that the other resource cannot provide, and it's getting certain other value from the second resource which the first resource cannot provide. So you have, for example, rice and beans. For human beings, beans are rich in lysine, which is an amino acid necessary for us. But beans are very low in sulfur-rich amino acids, whereas rice is rich in sulfur amino acids. And so therefore you've got, when we eat rice and beans, what we're getting is from the beans a certain resource which is lysine, and from the rice a certain resource, sulfur rich amino acids, which neither of them in isolation, neither of them alone can provide. So we have a diet only rich in beans, then we're losing out on sulfur rich amino acids. If you only eat rice and not other resources like beans, then you're losing out on things like lysine. And so these are complementary resources. Then you can have antagonistic resources. These are resources where, let's say you have two of these resources, and in isolation alone you feed on one particular resource, it does not harm you. You feed on the other second resource and it does not harm you. But if you feed on both those resources together at the same time, then there is a joint effect of those two resources that is negative. Those are called antagonistic resources. So for example, you could have a toxin in plant tissue, and you could have an insect that is eating leaves from that plant, and that toxin is present only in that plant, and while that insect eats leaves from that plant, that toxin in itself is not particularly affecting the insect species negatively. But you could have a situation where there is another toxin in a different plant species, and if the same individual insect eats leaves from both of those two species, then the fact that both those toxins are now incorporated into, both those toxins enter the system of this insect, can have effects, where both those toxins, when they come together, they produce negative outcomes for the organism. So those are antagonistic resources. And then you have inhibitory resources. These could be essential resources, but if they cross a certain threshold, if you go beyond a certain point on that resource axis, then those resources are actually lethal. So for example, plants require carbon dioxide and water for photosynthesis. If carbon dioxide and water are not available, then that plant will not be able to survive. But if carbon dioxide and water go beyond certain limits, certain extents, then that is lethal for the plant too. So even though they are essential resources, even though plants cannot survive without CO2, it doesn't mean that you can keep increasing the concentration of CO2 unlimitedly and not have an effect. So beyond a certain threshold of water or carbon dioxide, this will lead to a negative outcome for that organism. So this was about conditions and resources. Again, just to reiterate, conditions are abiotic properties of the environment, such as temperature. They cannot be consumed. Conditions cannot be depleted, but an organism can change conditions where it's found by doing what an organism does. So a plant can change concentration of gases in the atmosphere. Resources can be consumed, they can be depleted, they can be used up, they can actually be exhausted in nature. And so organisms will compete for resources. They will be in competition with each other for resources. Organisms do not compete for conditions. So no species can compete for another with another for temperature, but a species can compete with another for food. In some cases, what is a condition can also be a resource. So water for a whale or a fish is a condition, right? They live in water. That's the condition in which they live. But for a terrestrial animal, water can be a resource, is a resource, because water on land can be depleted, it can be used up, it can be finished. And so you can have situations where the same thing is a condition for certain species, but a resource for others. And with conditions and resources, what we are going to do is move on next to talk about fundamental and realized niches. Thank you and see you next time.